In 1939, a dying man lay in trance and named specific dates of specific events. The collapse of the Soviet Union, 50 years before it happened. The creation of the State of Israel, 7 years before it became reality. The economic crises of 1929 and 2008, with precise time periods indicated, 87% accuracy on medical diagnoses delivered remotely for people he had never seen, confirmed by physicians and preserved in the archives of the University of Atlantic. This is Edgar Cayce. His archives are studied, and among everything he described, among hundreds of verified predictions, there is one that concerns you personally, right now. This specific period, he called it the point of division. The moment when humanity would diverge, not politically and not geographically, but at the level of consciousness, at the level of who you choose to be right now. And what happens to you between 2025 and 2030 is determined not by external circumstances, but by the decisions you are making this week. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you will look at what is happening around you and at what is happening inside you in a completely different way. In 2023, researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a specific conclusion. The rate of change has exceeded the capacity of most people to adapt. Official science, specific numbers. What Cayce called acceleration is already happening, measurable, and he warned about this acceleration 80 years before it became obvious. But here is what is critical to understand from the start. Cayce did not predict a catastrophe. He predicted a transition. The difference is fundamental. A catastrophe is something that happens to you. A transition is something you participate in, and your participation, or its absence, determines which of two experiences you live through. Now, what exactly Cayce described about this period? In more than 300 readings dated 1932 to 1944, he spoke about 3 simultaneous processes that would occur at the beginning of the 21st century. The first, the acceleration of resonance. The internal states of people would begin manifesting in external events faster than at any previous point in history. Fear would create fear-confirming events, in months rather than years. Intention would create opportunities, at the same speed. Cayce was specific. During this period, it would become impossible to live for long in contradiction between what a person thinks and what they do. That contradiction would begin appearing outwardly with uncomfortable speed. The second process, the collapse of structures built on control and fear, not revolution, not war. Simply, structures that no longer correspond to the level of consciousness humanity is reaching would begin collapsing under their own weight. Financial bubbles inflated by fear, political systems based on manipulation, social constructs held together by coercion. Cayce described this as a natural process, like ice melting at a certain temperature, not because someone decided to melt it, because the temperature reached a point of transition. The third process, and this is the most important, the emergence of 2 parallel realities, in one physical world, in the same cities, with the same news, but with fundamentally different internal experiences for the people living through them. Now, a little-known Cayce prophecy that almost nobody quotes. In a reading from 1936, he described geological changes that were supposed to begin, and he named specific regions, in the area of the Great Barrier Reef and the zones of the Pacific Ring of Fire, approximately in the period 2020 to 2030. Observers tracking his predictions note the following. Volcanic activity in the Pacific region over the last 5 years has increased by 32% compared to the previous decade. The Great Barrier Reef has been experiencing unprecedented bleaching, meaning literal death, beginning in 2020. But here is what matters in this prophecy. Cayce said that geological changes and changes in human consciousness are not 2 separate processes. They are one process expressing itself through 2 different dimensions. The Earth responds to the collective consciousness of the people living on it, not metaphorically, as a literal physical system. And what we see outside, in the climate, in geopolitics, in social fractures, is the external reflection of what is happening inside collective consciousness, which means this: changing the external without changing the internal is impossible. This is what every spiritual tradition describes. This is what quantum physics describes as the non-locality of consciousness. This is what Cayce saw in trance 70 years ago. Now, the Akashic Records. Nobel laureate Erwin Schrödinger wrote about a non-local information field as a theoretical possibility. David Bohm, a student of Einstein, developed the concept of the implicate order, which mathematically describes exactly what mystics called the Akashic Records. This is not religion. This is physics with a different vocabulary. And what practitioners describe when working with this field about the period 2025 to 2030 coincides with Cayce, with a precision that is difficult to call coincidental. The Akashic Records describe this period not as the end of something, as a birth, painful, accompanied by contractions, but a birth. And what is being born is a new way of organizing human community. Not political, not economic, based on an entirely different principle, on conscious choice rather than coercion, on creation rather than protection, on connection rather than control. Now, a real story, not from the archives. From documented clinical experience, a woman, 44 years old, cardiac arrest in 2021, 17 minutes of clinical death. When she came back, she described not the classic experience of light and peace. She described something specific. She saw, her word, two streams, two different streams of people moving through the same space. One stream, people moving mechanically, without awareness, reacting to events around them like pinballs, without direction, without intention. The other stream, people moving more slowly but with direction, with something inside that she described as a fire, not aggressive fire, but the fire of a compass. She said, "I saw that both streams exist right now, in the same world, but they don't intersect. As if they live in parallel realities that sometimes see each other, but cannot truly interact." She saw that the second stream was smaller, but growing. And she saw that approximately in the middle of this decade, her words, not mine, something would happen that she called an acceleration of separation, when the two streams would begin diverging so quickly that the middle ground between them would become impossible. The psychologist who worked with her wrote in his report, "The content of this experience does not yield to explanation within known neurobiological mechanisms of hallucination, but I cannot deny that the described structure possesses an internal consistency that is not typical of hallucinatory states." Now, what the Akashic Records describe specifically by year. And this is the part that changes how you look at what is already happening. 2025. The records call this the year when acceleration becomes palpable for most people, not just for those in spiritual practice, for most. Ordinary people will begin physically feeling the gap between who they are and how they live. It will manifest as a growing sense of misalignment, as if the life you are living is not quite yours, as if somewhere there is another version that fits better. This is painful, but it is a signal rather than a symptom of illness. The records say in 2025 it becomes impossible to ignore internal discomfort. It has become too loud precisely because the time to hear it has arrived. 2026, the year of the first visible cracks in the systems, not necessarily collapse, but pressure strong enough that it is no longer possible to pretend that everything works as before. The records call this the year of questions. Most people will for the first time seriously ask a question they had been avoiding. Does the system I trusted my entire life actually work in my interests? This question will be painful, because an honest answer to it requires changing your life, and changing your life is frightening. And this is exactly where the division begins to accelerate. Those who ask the question honestly will begin moving toward the second stream. Those who convince themselves the question doesn't matter will deepen into the first. 2027. The records call this the year of choice, not political choice. Personal. In this year, every person will encounter a situation. Specific. Unavoidable. That will require an answer to the question, am I building something new or defending what is collapsing? Am I acting from vision or from fear? The records describe this year as a point of no return, not in the sense of catastrophe, but in the sense that after a certain level of awareness, it is no longer possible to pretend you don't know. It is no longer possible to return to an unconscious state. The decision made in 2027, small or large, will determine the next decade of each person's personal reality. 2028. The year when the separation of the two streams becomes visible to the naked eye. People who made decisions from intention in 2025 through 2027 will begin experiencing growing clarity. Opportunities will appear where others see only chaos. Connections will emerge where others see only fragmentation, not because they got lucky, because the law of resonance will begin working at full strength in both directions. Amazon was founded in a recession. Airbnb was founded in a financial crisis. Uber was founded in a period of maximum instability. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. People who made decisions from fear in 2025 through 2027 will begin experiencing growing pressure. The systems they relied on will develop cracks. This is not punishment. It is consequence. The law of resonance makes no exceptions. 2029. The records describe this year as the year when new communities, created by people of the second stream, begin becoming a visible alternative. Not a utopia, not a perfect world, but working systems based on different principles, on conscious choice rather than coercion, on transparency rather than control, on creating value rather than extracting it. The first signs will not be loud, they never are at the beginning, but they will be real. 2030. The point that both Cayce and the records describe as the completion of the transition. Not in the sense that everything is finished, in the sense that the new level of consciousness, the one that was being born painfully over 5 years, reaches critical mass. When an idea reaches critical mass of carriers, it stops being an idea and becomes reality. Cayce said, by 2030 it will be evident that something irreversible has occurred. Not everyone will see it immediately, but those who were in the process will recognize that feeling. The feeling of being on the right side of what history will call a turning point. Now, what specifically to do? And here, I want to be completely concrete, not spiritual advice, practical tools. The first, the pause as technology. Neuroscientist Jill Bolte Taylor documented the following in her work. The emotional chemical surge in the blood caused by a stimulus lasts 90 seconds. If you do not continue to mentally feed it, it fades on its own. 90 seconds. This is the interval in which an automatic fear-based reaction loses its power. This is the interval in which you can choose a conscious response. In the period of acceleration described by both Cayce and the records, the ability to use these 90 seconds separates people of the first stream from people of the second. This is not metaphysics. This is neurobiology. The second, intuition as a navigation tool. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, in his work The Error of Descartes, proved experimentally the body processes information faster and more accurately than the conscious mind. Through what he calls somatic markers, physical sensations that signal an assessment of a situation before the mind has had time to formulate it. In a period when external informational noise reaches its maximum, the ability to hear these internal signals becomes a critical skill. Meditation, any form of regular silencing of external noise, is the training of this skill, not a luxury, not a spiritual practice for special people, a practical navigation tool. The third, clearing what is unfinished. Every unforgiven resentment is a loop that reproduces similar situations. Every important unfinished task is energy holding the old in place rather than creating the new. Psychologists studying post-traumatic growth, this is an academic discipline with specific research, record the same pattern consistently. People who use a crisis as an opportunity to close unfinished loops emerge from it qualitatively different, not necessarily wealthier, more alive, more whole, more capable of creating what they actually want. In the period of acceleration, unfinished loops will reproduce faster, which is challenging. But the same acceleration means that the work of closing them, forgiveness, completion, honesty with yourself, will produce results in months that previously required years. The fourth, and this is something almost never mentioned in the context of these prophecies, the generation born after 2012. Cayce spoke about a specific generation of souls who would incarnate during the period of transformation with particular characteristics. Dolores Cannon, who spent 45 years regressing people under hypnosis, described the same thing from a different source. She called them the new souls or the waves. She said they arrive already adapted to the level of consciousness that adults are only now reaching, that their behavior, which looks like a problem, hyperactivity, inability to fit into standard systems, acute sensitivity, is not pathology but immunity to obsolete structures. If you have children born after 2012, look at them differently, not as people who need to be adapted to the existing system, as people who arrived with the skills needed for the new one. Their task is not to fit into what is collapsing. Their task is to be the first to begin building what comes in its place. And now the last thing, the most important of everything said. Cayce never said the future is fixed. This is what fundamentally distinguishes him from prophets predicting inevitable apocalypse. He said, probabilities exist, and they change depending on how the consciousness of people changes. Every decision made from intention, rather than from fear, is a small vote cast for the second reality, for the second stream that the woman saw in her near-death experience, for the new era that Cayce described. This voting does not happen once every 4 years. It happens every day, in every decision, in every pause between stimulus and reaction. And when enough of these votes align in the same direction, collective reality will change, not because someone decided it from above, because that is how resonance works. Write in the comments, do you feel this acceleration? That sense that the world is changing faster than you can adapt? Because if you do, Cayce would say that is not anxiety. That is your consciousness recognizing the moment he warned about. And what you do with it, starting this week, is your choice of trajectory.